I'm Richie Unterberger. I'm the author of Bob Marley and the Wailers, The Ultimate Illustrated History. And you're watching Mr. Media.
I'm Bob Andelman, and this is a Mr. Media interview. You can see, hear, and read more than 1,000 of my previous celebrity interviews at mrmedia.com. That's mrmedia.com. Subscribe to the show on YouTube, Apple Podcast, iTunes, Apple News, Google Play, Stitcher, and follow us on Twitter and Facebook. On today's show, I'll talk to Richie Unterberger, author of the new book, Bob Marley and the Wailers, The Ultimate Illustrated History. Stick around. I must admit that my knowledge of Bob Marley and the Wailers' history is pretty limited. The Jamaican-born singer and his band rose to prominence while I was in a too-damn-white-for-our-own-good high school, and he died suddenly while I was in college, before my 5-year run as a rock music critic in the mid-1980s. I knew his hits: I Shot the Sheriff, No Woman, No Cry, Buffalo Soldier, Get Up, Stand Up, One Love, People Get Ready, and Jamming, most of which have since been co-opted by Madison Avenue for commercials. Now, that said, it made me quite eager to learn more about what I didn't know, which, thanks to author Richie Unterberger and his new book, Bob Marley and the Wailers, The Ultimate Illustrated History, is quite a lot. The book is packed with the requisite and little-known history of Marley and the Wailers, through his discography, reviews of each Marley album, and the best part for me, at least, was the anecdotes, like Eric Clapton telling the story of the first time he spoke with Bob Marley, after the Brit covered I Shot the Sheriff, or what happened to early Wailers record producer Leslie Kong. And we'll see if Richie wants to share some of those. Richie Unterberger, welcome to Mr. Media.
Hi, Bob. Thanks for having me on.
Great to have you here. Richie, the thing I thought that kind of distinguished your books from others is the illustrated nature of it. Not to take anything away from the writing, which is excellent, but there's 300 photos in this book. Can you, before we get into the editorial content, the writing, can you talk a little bit about how deep in the archive you and or the editors had to go to find this stuff?
Voyager Press, which is the publisher, does quite a few of these books, which are about major figures in music and, as you say, very amply illustrated. And I give some suggestions, but actually the publisher is primarily responsible for selecting and acquiring the images. With Bob Marley, there's a little more of a challenge than there was, say, with Fleetwood Mac, which was another book in the series that I was the author for. Fleetwood Mac were photographed very often from the time they formed in 1967 until the present, about 50 years later. And Bob Marley and the Wailers, for the first 10 years or so of their career, there are some photos, but not a great deal, because they were primarily known in their native Jamaica. They weren't yet known in North America and Europe very much. So for those years, which are very important in my view, those first 10 years of their career, there are some photos in the book, but also there are record labels, there are advertisements, and there are also pictures of early reggae music in general in Jamaica. But from about 1973 onward in Bob Marley's life, he died in 1981, he was on a very big label, Island Records, and known throughout the world, and was photographed very often, being the most famous reggae musician. And the publisher was able to get images from very different parts of his career and also some very different facets of Bob Marley and the Wailers as performers. You see them on stage, you see them, being more relaxed off stage, being interviewed. There are some magazine covers, also some record covers and labels. They took a lot of care in very specific images on their album covers. And there's miscellaneous stuff like concert posters. So there's, I think, a good deal of variety throughout his career in the images that are represented. And hopefully they complemented the text, where I tried to give a pretty concise but thorough overview of both their musical development and also their influence, not just on reggae music, but on music throughout the world.
Well, and the reason I asked about the photos was as a way to get into the editorial, because you talk about several points where I mean, let's use Fleetwood Mac as an example. Fleetwood Mac's history is pretty well documented because of where they came from, where they were. The Marley story, there's dates and pressings and the appearance of certain singles and stuff. It's all kind of vague, and none of the, you point out that none of the previous history that's been written or gathered, a lot of it doesn't agree with everything else, making your job very difficult.
Yeah, well, not so much difficult. It makes it interesting in a way because I try to figure out what happened, and often you can't because there are contradictory accounts. Sometimes the Wailers gave contradictory accounts. What I did, I hope, is present possibilities of what happened and note that we don't know for sure exactly what happened when, but this is what could or probably happened, and these are some reasons for that. And I'll just give one quick example. Before the Wailers became known throughout the world in the mid-1970s, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, Bob Marley often visited his mother, who had moved to the United States in Delaware, in Wilmington, kind of near Philadelphia. And there are many different accounts of when he went, why he went, and how long he stayed. Something that baffled me is if this guy and the Wailers are so big in Jamaica, doesn't it say a lot about the state of the Jamaican industry that he feels like he can make more money working in an auto plant in Delaware or working as a waiter? There are various accounts of what he did in Delaware. We're never probably going to be able to find out exactly what he did when, but it's interesting to me that even if you sold a lot of records within Jamaica, Jamaica is a very small country. There were about 2 million people there. And if you were a superstar in Jamaica, it wasn't like being the Temptations here. It wasn't like, oh, you're touring all around the world. You might not be making as much money as you hope from your records, but you're making good money by the standards of anybody in the United States. You weren't making really great money as a Jamaican superstar artist who was a great innovator, too. And part of the reason he went to Delaware, I think, was to periodically check up on his mother and be with his mother. But also, he was like trying to save money to help start his own label in Jamaica, to buy recording equipment. And that, I think, is part of the reason he and the Wailers were so eager to get recognition abroad, even though they were so well known in Jamaica.
Well, I think you make the point in there. I hope I get the numbers right. You said that if he had like a best-selling record, which in and of itself is kind of hard to track, but if he sold 70 or 80,000 copies of a single in Jamaica, that would be the equivalent across the United States of selling 5 million copies. That it's a massive thing. But the bookkeeping was not so good. He wasn't collecting royalties early on a lot of stuff. The whole thing, it was just a very different system. I just thought it was really interesting. Also, when you talk about his youth, I was very surprised. I was extremely surprised. Nothing wrong with it, but I was extremely surprised to find out that his dad was a white guy. His dad really had very little, if anything, to do with him, and died when Marley was very young. I think you're right, but I don't think anyone looking at a picture of Bob Marley would ever have guessed that his dad was white. And maybe it's probably common knowledge, and it points up that I didn't know that much about Bob Marley, but I was very surprised by that.
Yeah, and there's still not a whole lot known about his father, who was of British ancestry but was working in Jamaica at the time that Jamaica was a British colony. It was a British colony until 1962, when Marley was still a teenager. But Marley said at some points that he felt that maybe that's why his music was kind of a world music, not just a Jamaican music, but a music for people of the world, because, you can't do a genetic study of this, but he feels that like he inherited inclinations from different races, as did quite a few Jamaicans, there being quite a few British people in Jamaica.
Sure.
And that's maybe part of the reason that his music appeals to so many people in so many different countries, is that his ancestry was both white European and Jamaican, Caribbean. And the music that came out of him was a lot more Caribbean and Jamaican, I think, certainly, than white. But he also, especially when he signed to Island Records, an international record label, was conscious of combining some elements of rock music with the reggae that he had helped develop in Jamaica.
Well, and I think you talk about how, Chris Blackwell did not start off planning to be, Chris Blackwell Island Records didn't start off planning to be have a label that was rock and roll, but by the time Marley got there, it was really heavily rock and roll. But also, it's also interesting, and I don't want to keep dwelling on race. I know I'm the one who brought it up, but the other interesting thing regarding that is, of course, one of his biggest paydays was when Eric Clapton, again a white guy, a British white guy, I should point out, covered "I Shot the Sheriff," and I believe it went to #1 or it was top 5.
Yes.
Right? So it's interesting. You would look at Bob Marley and not think, you just wouldn't immediately think of a white connection, but his dad was, and Eric Clapton covering him. There's a little logic there, even if it's nonsensical. I don't know exactly where I'm going here, but I thought it was very interesting reading this. And then, of course, the other thing that really cracked me up. So, did you actually hear Barbra Streisand's cover of the Bob Marley song, the Guava Jelly?
Yes, which is one of the first interpretations of a Bob Marley song by an artist outside of Jamaica. It's not so great, but
no, I would think not.
Yeah, but with the cover versions of Bob Marley songs in general, in the mid-'70s, it helped make people aware of his music, just like when the Rolling Stones did songs by people like Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf, Rufus Thomas, a lot of Black Americans.
Right.
And the journey of a Bob Marley song to Eric Clapton is not as strange as I think one might think, because reggae music, when it was developing in the 1960s and early 1970s, took a great deal of influence from American soul music, which was done by African Americans, primarily, of course. And British rock musicians, since the British invasion started in 1963 and 1964, had always looked to Black American music for a lot of their inspiration, whether it was blues or soul music. Reggae is, in a way, a kind of a form of soul music. And British musicians being inspired or liking reggae music enough to do some of the songs, it's not that much different than British musicians doing songs by Chicago blues musicians or by Motown artists. Mm-hmm. And also, I think, fortunately, very quickly, after Eric Clapton had a hit with I Shot the Sheriff, after Johnny Nash, a Black American soul singer, had a hit with Stir It Up, which was a Wailers song, people really zeroed in on the Wailers songs. And by the late 1970s, people wanted to hear Bob Marley doing his songs. They were more familiar with his versions of his own music than they were by other people doing his songs. Mm-hmm. And certainly today, they're mostly familiar with Bob Marley's versions of his own songs.
Right. And you take that introduction any way you can. I mean, Marley, I think you write in the book that Marley and the Wailers, which at the time included Peter Tosh and Bunny Livingston, they, in the early days, they were recording so much music. They were covering Black American R&B songs and all kinds of stuff. Also, the music of the era was ska and rocksteady, and it was just a big melange of different types of forms. So, very interesting. And of course, a lot of British bands in the, late 70s. It's more like the early mid 80s. Ska music hit very big over there, which in some ways I always thought of as kind of reggae with a faster beat to it. It's
sure,
right, and a little more fun. Was a lot of the reggae. I don't really think of a lot of reggae as humorous. A lot of the ska music I do think of as humorous. It always, I always found it kind of amusing, and sometimes it's the lyrics, sometimes it was the presentation of it, but you can see the flow there of the different types. Yeah,
and it's interesting to me, a lot of people don't realize that Bob Marley, as well as some other major reggae performers like Jimmy Cliff and Toots and the Maytals, they started with ska music. When they started making records, reggae was not a term It's a term that's been applied since like about the early 1970s. But they started with that ska music, which is much faster in tempo, as you noted, in rhythm, than the reggae music that we're a lot more familiar with. And the music kind of slowed down, and as the music slowed down, maybe it was coincidence, but the subject matter started to become more serious. But the Wailers in their early days, I'm talking like 1964 through 1966, they did quite a few terrific ska records. And sometimes when they weren't writing their own material, they did songs by the Impressions, but they did some unlikely cover versions. They did And I Love Her by the Beatles, which is a really good version, by the way. And they also did What's New Pussycat by Tom Jones, written by Burt Bacharach and Hal David. And that's not such a good version. They were trying different things, but they settled on their style certainly by the end of the 1960s.
I was just thinking, I hadn't thought about this before, but it would probably be interesting to have you kind of issue a list of suggested listening while reading this book, like chapter by chapter. You should listen to these two songs and then these two songs, and that would probably be a great way to get the progression of how Marley's sound evolved. But also, I was just, as you were talking about that, I was thinking, yeah, I'd like to hear that version of What's New Pussycat by Marley and the Wailers. Can you talk a little bit about how, a little more, I should say, about how Marley and the Wailers, how their sound evolved? I don't think a lot of people even realize that they were an act going back to the early and mid-'60s. Most people know them from their 70s production, when they hit Britain, when they hit the United States. But how did they change over, say, a 20, 25-year period?
The first third or so of the book goes into that at some length, but generally they formed when they were teenagers in Trenchtown, the neighborhood of Kingston, Jamaica, which is pretty poor and rather tough still to this day. And their original models, as I mentioned a while ago, were the American soul groups, especially the ones that did harmonies, the biggest of them being, the biggest influence, being Curtis Mayfield and the Impressions. And if you listen to some of the very earliest Wailers recordings, it's almost like hearing what we call doo-wop here, these very close 3-part, sometimes 4-part harmonies. At the very beginning, also, I think this is interesting, the Wailers had some different members. They had a couple of women who were with the Wailers briefly. You can hear them on the very early records. They had a lead singer on a few of their early records, Junior Braithwaite, who actually, when he was very young in 1964, left Jamaica for the United States. But then they settled on the core of Bob Marley, Bunny Livingston, as he was then known, and Peter Tosh. Also, Bob's wife, Rita Marley, sings on quite a few of their late 60s records, and then after that, on stage and on record, and she contributed quite a lot. But they changed from being a very good ska group who sometimes commented on the social environment that they were growing up in Trenchtown, to a rock steady group, meaning slowing down the rhythm and maybe giving it more of a Jamaican feel to the rhythm, but also starting to get into more serious subject matter. This happened at the same time that they became followers of the Rasta faith, which is very hard to summarize, even in a book, let alone on an interview, but something that gave a great deal of importance to Black identity, whether it was Blacks in Jamaica or the United States or certainly in Africa, and also gave a lot of credence to rituals that had often originated in Africa. What Rasta got the most attention for at first on an international level were some more superficial elements. The dreadlocks, the very long hair that you see still to this day on a lot of Jamaicans and a lot of youth throughout the world these days. But also marijuana was considered not so much a recreational drug, but also a sacrament that was part of the ritual of getting closer to a spiritual being. It was a very controversial faith in Jamaica, even among a lot of Blacks in Jamaica who had been raised Christian, because it was not something that was the dominant belief system, but it was something that the Wailers and many other early reggae musicians who changed their faith took very seriously, and also not just the religious elements of Rasta, but also a feeling that justice should be pursued for Black people around the world started to make its way into the lyrics very strongly. In some of their famous songs, like Get Up, Stand Up, you hear a very joyous expression of this, but in other songs like Trenchtown Rock that might not be as well known, there are also depictions of the injustice that was suffered routinely by Black Jamaicans in Jamaica in the 1970s. And unfortunately, African Americans here and Blacks throughout the world in varying degrees to this day. I think the conditions for African Americans in the United States are better than they were when Bob Marley and the Wailers emerged, but there's still a lot of work to be done as far as gaining African Americans more respect and gaining the underclass of all races more equality in the United States and throughout the world. Bob Marley and the Wailers were among the first acts to vocalize this in their music very often. Not always, just like Bob Dylan didn't always do protest songs when he first started recording folk music, but often. And that's a big reason that people around the world relate to his music.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say, Marley would not lack for things to write about in this day and age. Socially speaking, unfortunately, you probably would have thought, well, if I could look ahead 30 years, everything will be taken care of. We'll have fixed all these things. And sadly, not the case. So if you had to explain what made Marley so special, could you do it in a few sentences? Why does he endure, for example?
I think that the most popular of his songs they're very catchy. You never underestimate that in the delivery of serious messages through music and through art. Very easy to sing along with, very easy to kind of almost chant along with. In concert footage, you often hear him urging people to sing along, and you can do that very easily. But also the messages, they might seem kind of basic. It's not a platform being laid out by President Obama in his speeches. It's not that complex. Not that Obama couldn't make it understandable, but
right.
In a song, you can't lay out all of those principles in 3 to 5 minutes. But Bob Marley was very adept at doing that with a musical setting that was very approachable to not just Black Jamaican listeners, but as it turned out, to Africans. He's immensely popular in Africa. He might be more popular than the Beatles, who are very popular in Africa, like they are throughout the world, and also very popular to rock audiences. Now, I mentioned this a little in the book. Some writers have gone into this in greater depth. It was of great frustration to Bob Marley that he wasn't more popular among African Americans. In a way, it's like what Jimi Hendrix went through 10 to 15 years before Marley. Jimi Hendrix was very quickly, after he did his first album, extremely popular among white Americans, some white Europeans. And there were some Black Americans who really dug Jimi Hendrix's music, but not in the same numbers that whites did. And it's a little puzzling because Jimi Hendrix drew on a great many Black traditions in blues and soul music. Bob Marley was starting to make inroads into the Black American audience, but by the time he died in the early 80s, he was still much more popular among whites in the United States because his music was kind of a bridge between rock and soul music and also world music, if we count it as Jamaican music. And for some reason, it's hard to say why, it wasn't catching on to the same extent among Black Americans. He wanted to, it was a goal of his to make greater inroads into that audience when cancer overtook him at a young age in his mid-30s. So the short one-sentence answer, his music is inspirational to a wider demographic around the world than almost any other musician.
You mentioned in the book a few times how much he really wanted to break through, and not just to a Black audience, but he wanted to break through in the United States very badly. He wanted to be bigger here. And you tell what I thought was a funny story. You talk about and I'm going to ask you, I guess, to kind of tell the story. But why is it that Marley declined the opportunity to be the opening act for the Grateful Dead at one point in his career? I just thought this was quite funny, considering how badly he wanted to get bigger in the United States. But what was his reason for declining that opportunity after they flew him up to San Francisco and wanted to get to know him?
There are several explanations you'll find in books, and maybe if Marley had survived, he would have continued giving different explanations. But one of the most prominent one, I'm pretty sure it's the one you were referring to, was because the name kind of spooked him, the Grateful Dead. It's like, you don't want to bother the dead. You don't want to bring up that kind of bad voodoo mojo vibe by associating yourself with a group called the Grateful Dead. I never thought of the Grateful Dead's music as something that was especially disturbing or would go into that level of controversy. And I think the real reason he didn't go with the Grateful Dead's management at the time was maybe he thought, they're not going to make me the number one priority. They might make the Grateful Dead or some other white rock band who they also manage, or the white rock bands that they manage, their bigger priorities. He wanted to be with an organization where he was number one, or maybe he had a greater voice than he would have if he was part of a larger management system. But that was one reason he gave. And maybe he just didn't feel like the vibe was right. Maybe that was a reason he gave as an excuse. Maybe it was like, well, the Grateful Dead just have a different music and a different audience. So it doesn't make that much sense for me to be in their management umbrella.
And just so people know, the management of the Grateful Dead that wanted to take over management of Bob Marley and the Wailers, that was Bill Graham.
At that time.
Very famous promoter and legendary promoter, really. So, if you were eventually going to be ripped off by a white American promoter, might as well be Bill Graham, I guess most people would think. It's interesting. There was one of the pieces of art that I really liked in the book, sort of relates to this. When Marley first played in the United States, it was, I think, at Max's Kansas City in New York.
Yes.
And there's a piece of art. There was another guy. There was a white band that was that was also just starting to make appearances in New York. Maybe folks have heard of him. Springsteen, the E Street Band, something like that. So there's an ad with the two of them. I think Marley was opening for Springsteen, but neither one of them were particularly well known at the time. So it was a great piece of art to capture for that,
Yeah, that's 1973. And can you imagine being able to see both of those acts at a time when they're just emerging? In a small club. I mean, Max is legendary, but it's not that big. It's not like going to the Fillmore.
Right.
So that must have been a special experience. And I'm sure a lot of the people who already knew Springsteen didn't know much about Marley and vice versa. So a lot of them might have come out of there thinking, wow, I thought I was going to be seeing this up-and-coming act, but I kind of got double the value for my money.
I think what the FM jocks of the 70s and 80s would call a Tuesday twofer. So I'm thinking you probably were inundated with Marley music through the course of this, that you probably heard a lot of stuff. Do you have any gems you would recommend people go looking for that you heard that would be considered kind of rare, but would be worth it to any Marley fan to dig up?
There's not much these days which is really rare, because the music of Bob Marley and the music when he was with the Wailers through 1973, 1974, it's very well distributed now. But I would emphasize again that because the first 10 years or so of his career aren't so well known before the Catch a Fire album came out, there is a lot of good music there. We've mentioned a couple of oddities, And I Love Her, which I like, and What's New Pussycat, which I don't think was so good. But if you go to the ska material they recorded with a producer named Coxsone Dodd between 1964 and 1966, there are some great songs there. There's Dancing Shoes is a great one. And that is one I want to emphasize because Bob Marley is not on that record. That was recorded when he was in Delaware for 6 to 8 months in 1966. Bunny Wailer sings lead on there. That's a great ska song, and it's evidence, as I emphasize in some early parts of the book, the Wailers were a band. It was not, sometimes they were billed as Bob Marley and the Wailers, but they were a band where they had 3 really good singers and the other guys were good writers too. So on songs where Peter Tosh wrote and sang the lead, and songs where Bunny Wailer took the lead, he didn't do that much writing. They're very good, and songs where they all come together, it's like, you know, almost hearing a Beatles of reggae, 3 talented singers and songwriters in the same band. The records they did in the late 1960s for their own label, Waylon Solemn, they're really good if you like soul music and you want a combination of soul and reggae, because they hadn't really arrived at a point where they were doing what we would call full-blown reggae music. There were still a lot of influences from American groups like the Wailers and the Temptations. So there's a compilation, it's in the discography in the book, of the Waylon Solemn material. It's about 20 songs. Sorry. And almost all of them are really good, and most of them are songs that they were writing. I had mentioned Trenchtown Rock as a song that they recorded more than once, and the early version before they became famous, it's more what reggae fans call roots, not as much rock production. Both or all the versions are good, but if you want something a little rawer and a little more Jamaican in feel, you can call up that track or others that they recorded in Jamaica and would re-record. Stir It Up, which is one of his most well-known songs, was recorded back in the late 60s in more of a Jamaican-soaked version. And then that was, of course, one of the songs that Johnny Nash, the American soul singer, did to help make Marley more popular. But it's hard, you know, I've written about the Beatles a lot, and sometimes people say, what's your favorite Beatles song? And I can't name it. I teach courses on the Beatles, too. And it's like, well, how do you pick one or two? The Wailers had a longer career. The Beatles were recording for about 7-8 years. So to pick one song of the Wailers, it's really almost impossible. You know, Peter Tosh is someone whose solo career I go into in the book, if I can, I hope answer your question just a little more. And some of his songs after the Wailers are very good. And some of them are remakes of songs he did with the Wailers. So if you want to combine, you know, go to the Wailers version, it's very interesting, like The Toughest, or like Don't Look Back, which was a Temptation song the Wailers did a reggae version of. And then Peter Tosh did it with Mick Jagger on one of his solo records. It's very interesting if you want to get an idea of their progression, if there are different versions of the same song the Wailers do, to play them back to back. That gives you a very good idea of how they changed.
Before we kind of wrap up, I got to ask you about Leslie Kong. So Kong produced an album, a collection of songs for the Wailers, called it The Best of the Wailers, I think. Or was it The Best of Bob Marley and the Wailers, or The Best of the Wailers?
Best of the Wailers, you're right.
Best of the Wailers. Okay, so I'll let you take it from here if you don't mind, but tell the story of what happened from that point with Leslie Kong.
Sure. Leslie Kong was one of Jamaican reggae's most famous and best, to give him his credit, early reggae producers. As you can tell from his name, Chinese, you know, Jamaican society was more multi-ethnic than people realize. And at a point where the Wailers wanted to start making albums that hung together very well as LPs, as they called them in those days, you know, 40 minutes or so, have a very strong album, not just have it be a collection of singles or just songs that happen to be recorded around the same time. He helped them produce the first album that could stand alone. It wasn't a single so much for the Wailers. But to help get more sales, he called this album that he had produced for them The Best of the Wailers. It was just an album that they did over a period of months, but he called it The Best of the Wailers, probably to try to mislead at least some people at record stores, thinking we're going to get like a collection of their best singles or their most famous songs. And the Wailers were very unhappy about that. And Bunny Wailer, he's told the story in different ways, but as he's told it, he kind of laid a curse on Leslie Kong. He said, well, if you're calling them this album The Best of the Wailers, it must mean that you don't think that the Wailers are going to be around very long, but also you're probably not going to be around very long because you want to cash in on the Wailers while you can. And Leslie Kahn just kind of laughed it off. Now, if you look at some of the material that's been written about the Wailers, last time I checked, this was still on Wikipedia, it gives the impression that he died like a week later, unexpectedly. That's not true. It was more like a year later. You have to be cautious about that.
Yeah.
But he died relatively soon after Bunny Wailer said this to him, about a year afterward. So,
and I feel terrible because I'm laughing, but it's been, it's been 40, 45 years, but I just thought that was the funniest thing in the whole book. It just,
And Leslie Kahn was a young man, not, are you thinking, well, he was 60 and maybe he was due to die anyway. It was unexpected, dying of not being shot, but dying of illness. So if one believes in such things, I don't make a big deal of playing up the mystic elements of the Wailers too much in the book, but if you believe in such things, you might call it cosmic justice. I don't, think you deserve to die for trying to exploit someone's catalog. But this is a story that Buddy Wailer, tells often.
Yeah, it's interesting. Every so often, I was reading the book, and I would stop what I was doing, and I'd interrupt my wife, and I'd say, "Listen, I got to read this to you." And I won't make you tell the Eric Clapton story, but it's a great story, folks. Get the book. There's a great story in there about Eric Clapton gets a call from Bob Marley after I Shot the Sheriff becomes a big hit, and Clapton's comments on what they discussed just made me laugh, just like the Grateful Dead story and this the Leslie Kahn. There's some really funny moments in there, and again, it's that much more interesting because you don't necessarily think of Bob Marley as a guy where there's a lot of funny anecdotes connected, but there's some really things in the book that make you go, that's interesting, that's good.
Also, I think whether they're humorous or not, and there are some that are humorous, as you point out, something that's so interesting about the Marley story, even aside from his music, which is really interesting, the progression of his career and the Wailers' career was so unexpected and in a way miraculous, like a lot of these great music stories are, Elvis Presley or the Beatles, where they start from such modest beginnings, more modest than Elvis, who was a poor southern white fellow even, because Jamaica was such a small country out of the international media spotlight. And as we've said, if you became a huge star in Jamaica, it didn't mean you were going to become well known anywhere else. But by the end of his life, which unfortunately was curtailed by illness, Bob Marley was getting about almost as famous as anybody. To come from such humble origins and to spread this gospel of both reggae music and his own music around the world was incredible. Mm-hmm. He did it by the time he was in his mid-30s. It's amazing.
Yeah, it's a remarkable thing about Marley, and that's why I was so interested to read about him, because I didn't know much about him. As I mentioned in the introduction, the timing of his passing and my covering rock and roll in the '80s, it was just off slightly. I mean, I covered I went to plenty of reggae and ska acts and that kind of thing in the '80s, but it wasn't Marley, and Marley was off the picture. But Marley has held up and become bigger in death than anyone would have guessed. I mean, he is the Elvis Presley of his genre or the Beatles. I mean, he's that big worldwide, and probably way bigger than even I can imagine in the United States, considering around the world. So I thought it was fascinating. It was just a really interesting read, and I was really glad that it came my way. I guess my last question is: so you mentioned that you had worked on a similar type of Fleetwood Mac book. Got anything else coming up you can tell folks about it?
I don't have a publishing deal now. If I had a publishing deal, I'm not superstitious. I'm always like, this is the book that's coming out. But I'd just like to mention, I've done about a dozen books on music history. I've done books on the Beatles, The Who, focusing on the early 1970s, the Velvet Underground, Lou Reed's first band. I did a big book on how folk and rock mixed in the 1960s. There's information about all of my books on my website, richieunterberger.com, if you want to check that out.
You know what? The next thing I was going to say, I was going to tell people where they can get the book. Folks, you can find Richie Unterberger's latest book, Bob Marley and the Wailers, The Ultimate Illustrated History, in great stores everywhere, or you can order it right now at a great price at MrMedia.com. If you are watching the show on MrMedia.com, probably right over there under the video, you'll see the cover of the book. You can click on it. It'll take you to Amazon. You can have it physically, probably in a day or two. I don't know. Is the book available as an ebook? Can it be downloaded as well?
I should have checked on that before I did my first interviews for the book. I don't know yet. And also, if there are plans to make it available, sometimes the ebook isn't available immediately. Hopefully, Bob, you could check on that after we get off.
Maybe so. So click on.
The book just came out a couple days ago, folks.
Well, click on the cover. It'll let you know what editions are available. If it's an ebook, or sometimes books like this that have a lot of art, they're available from iBooks, from Apple's bookstore, and not necessarily some of the others, or they might be. So check that out. So you mentioned your website is richieunterberger.com.
That's right.
All right. Are you on Twitter or Facebook? Can people find you through social media?
Yeah, I'm on both.
Okay. Well, Richie, it was a really interesting book. I think I tried to give some examples of the things that really got my attention, and I enjoyed reading it. And thank you very much for joining us on Mr. Media today.
Thanks for having me on, Bob.
Mr. Media is recorded live before a studio audience of Kingston, Jamaica townies ready to pounce at the first slip of a Rastafarian accent coming from an overly enthusiastic white boy in the new media capital of the world, St. Petersburg, Florida.
Hi, this is Rich Scheidner. And if you've ever wondered what it was like to be a stand-up comedian in the 1980s, I'm going to do you a big favor. Instead of billions of dollars for a time machine, you can just spend $24.95 and buy my new book, Kicking Through the Ashes, My Life as a Stand-Up in the 1980s Comedy Boom. It will save you money and give you thrills. It will take you there. Go to my website, richscheidner.com, go to amazon.com, and buy this book.